Today, we're going deep, really deep, into the fascinating history of the Bible.
It's a book with a past, that's for sure. And we're going to trace how it became the English version that so many people are familiar with.
And we have some really compelling research here to help us. This stuff traces the Bible's origins and the whole journey it took through translations.
It's a story about how the Bible shaped culture. It's pretty epic, really.
It is, and we're all about getting you up to speed efficiently, right? So, for our listeners, think of this as your fast track to understanding how this incredibly influential text came to be.
We'll be highlighting those turning points, those surprising connections, and really focusing on the big picture.
That's right. We're all about those key insights so you walk away with a clear grasp of how the Bible evolved and how it continues to influence us today.
So, why don't we start with the fundamentals? The Bible has two major parts, right? The Old Testament and the New Testament.
Okay, so let's break those down a little bit. The Old Testament, which is sometimes called the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh, this is the older section.
Exactly. Think of it as a collection of writings that came out of ancient Israel and Judah.
Got it.
And these writings span a huge period, like roughly 1,000 years. We're talking 12th century BCE to the 2nd century BCE.
Wow. That's a long time.
It is. And during that time, all sorts of things happened that shaped these writings. Take the Babylonian exile, for example.
Okay, so what was that?
Well, the Babylonians conquered the kingdom of Judah and exiled a lot of the population to Babylon.
I see.
It was a huge turning point for the Jewish people. Really forced them to rethink some things. You see this reflected in their theology.
So what changed?
Well, they started putting even more emphasis on monotheism, the belief in one God.
Right.
And they also developed the idea of a covenant, like a special agreement with God. The idea was that this covenant could be broken and renewed.
That's pretty intense.
It is, and you see these themes coming out strongly in the writings of the prophets like Isaiah, and also in the historical stories in Genesis.
Yeah.
It's a time when they were grappling with displacement and trying to make sense of their relationship with God.
So the Old Testament, it's not just like a straightforward history book. It's more like a reflection of a people going through some really challenging times.
Yeah, exactly. It's way more complex than that.
Okay, cool. And what kinds of writings are actually in the Old Testament?
Well, it's a mix. You've got those historical narratives, the stories of the Israelites.
Yeah.
You've got laws that guided their society, and then the words of the prophets, which can be pretty inspiring and sometimes a bit challenging. There's also poetry, songs, expressions of all sorts of human emotions, and of course religious teachings that really form the foundation of their faith.
Wow, okay, so there's a lot in there. Then we move on to the New Testament, which comes later. Right?
Yeah, much later. Right about the 1st century CE. This is where we start hearing from the early followers of Jesus.
Right.
And the New Testament really revolves around him, his life, and what he taught. That's what the Gospels are all about.
Okay.
Then we have the epistles, which are letters from important figures like Paul. He was writing to those early Christian communities, offering guidance and insights about their beliefs.
And the book of Revelation is in there too, right?
Absolutely. That one's all about these intense visions, the apocalypse, and what the end times might look like. It's a really interesting part of the New Testament. It's worth noting, though, that the New Testament emerged in a very specific historical and cultural context.
What was that context like?
Well, we're talking about the Hellenistic world, which had a strong influence from ancient Greece.
Okay.
This was also during the Roman occupation of Judea.
So there was a lot going on.
Definitely. And within Judaism itself, there was a lot of diversity. This was the time of the Second Temple.
What was the Second Temple?
It was the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, standing from around 516 BCE until the Romans destroyed it in 70 CE. And during that time, you had different groups within Judaism, like the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes.
Were those like different denominations?
Kind of. They all had their own interpretations of Jewish law and traditions.
I see.
It was a really dynamic period within Judaism, and this definitely influenced the way Christianity emerged and developed its own identity.
So you've got all these texts, all these different books, but they didn't just automatically become the Bible, right? There was a process of choosing which ones were considered sacred.
You're absolutely right. That's the process we call canonization.
Okay. So how did they decide which books made it in?
It was a gradual process with lots of discussion and debate within the early communities. For the Hebrew Bible, Jewish scholars reached the general consensus on the core texts by around the 2nd century CE.
So that was relatively early on.
Yeah. The Christian canon took a bit longer to solidify, though. They were still figuring things out. And it wasn't until the late 4th century CE that they really settled on the books that we have in the New Testament today.
What were they looking for when they were making those decisions?
Several factors came into play. One big one was apostolic authorship.
Meaning that the book had to be written by an apostle.
Yeah, or at least by someone who was really close to an apostle. They also looked at how widely accepted the book was within the early Christian communities.
So if a lot of churches were already using a book, that was a good sign.
Exactly. And of course, they were concerned about theological consistency. They wanted to make sure that the book's teachings aligned with what was already considered core Christian belief.
Makes sense.
And there were some key church councils where important decisions were made. One was in Hippo in 393 CE, and another was in Carthage just a few years later in 397 CE.
So these weren't just random decisions. There was a real process behind it.
Oh, definitely. It was a very deliberate and thoughtful process shaped by those early communities wrestling with these really profound questions of faith and what they believed.
It's amazing to think that these texts and the choices about which ones were important were all happening in very specific historical contexts.
Oh, absolutely. As your research points out, the political landscape, the social dynamics, and the religious climate of the time, all of these things played a huge role in shaping both what was written and how those writings were ultimately compiled and accepted as sacred.
Okay, so now let's talk about how these texts were actually shared and kept safe over the centuries, before printing presses and all that.
Right, back in the day, it was all about oral tradition at first. They'd pass down those stories, teachings, and prayers through spoken word.
Word of mouth.
Exactly. But eventually they started writing these things down. First on scrolls, and later in codices, which are more like the books we know today.
I can't even imagine copying an entire book by hand. That sounds so tedious.
It was incredibly demanding work. Scribes dedicated their entire lives to copying those texts Word for word, letter for letter.
That's a level of dedication we just don't see much anymore.
Right. It shows you how deeply they valued those writings, how important it was to preserve them.
And of course, when you're doing everything by hand, there's always the possibility of little errors creeping in.
Oh, for sure. And you got to remember, they didn't have spell check back then.
No kidding. But despite those challenges, they were committed to protecting those sacred writings.
Absolutely. That commitment is really inspiring when you think about it.
Okay, so Christianity starts spreading. You've got all these different languages, different cultures.
Yeah.
That's where translation becomes really important, right?
It does, because you can't expect everyone to learn Hebrew and Greek just to read these texts.
Right.
As Christianity moved beyond those initial language groups, it needed to communicate its message to a much wider audience. And one of the first big steps in that direction was the Septuagint.
Refresh my memory. What exactly was the Septuagint?
Well, it was the first major translation of the Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, into Greek. Yeah, this happened back in the 3rd century BCE.
So way before the New Testament was even written.
Exactly.
Why Greek?
Greek was like the common language back then, at least in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was the language of scholarship and trade, kind of like English is today in many parts of the world.
I see. So translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek opened it up to a huge new audience.
Exactly. It was like opening up a whole library to a bunch of new readers.
Mm-hmm.
It really helped spread those stories and teachings to a much wider group of people.
Makes sense. So then later on, you have Latin becoming really dominant in the Western Roman Empire.
Right. As the Western Roman Empire grew, Latin became the main language for the church in that part of the world.
Okay.
And that led to another really important translation, the Vulgate.
I've heard of that one. What's the story there?
The Vulgate was St. Jerome's masterpiece.
St. Jerome.
Yeah, he was a scholar, a priest, lived in the 4th century CE. He translated the whole Bible into Latin.
The whole thing?
The whole thing, both Old and New Testaments. And this translation, the Vulgate, became the standard Bible for Western Christianity for over 1,000 years.
Wow.
It had an immeasurable impact on theology, law, and culture throughout the West. It's hard to overstate how important this translation was.
It's amazing to think how Christianity itself grew so much during this period, from this small movement to a world religion.
It is a remarkable journey, and you have to remember that certain historical events really accelerated that growth. For instance, when Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE, that removed a lot of the obstacles to its spread.
Makes sense.
And then later in the 4th century, Emperor Theodosius actually made Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire.
So it went from being persecuted to being in charge. That's a huge shift.
Right. And throughout this whole period of expansion, the Bible was central.
Okay, what do you mean?
It provided the foundation for Christian doctrine, it shaped their worship practices, and it was essential for their missionary efforts as they spread their message throughout the world.
Got it. Now, let's move ahead to the Middle Ages. We start seeing this growing desire for the Bible to be available in English.
Yes.
But not everyone in power was thrilled about that idea.
That's a key point. During the Middle Ages, the church was pretty resistant to translating the Bible into languages that everyday people could understand.
Why was that?
Well, they were worried about misinterpretations.
Oh, okay. I can see how that might be a concern.
Right. They felt like people needed theological training to really understand the complexities of the text.
So they thought it was better to keep it in Latin, which most people couldn't read.
Yeah, they believed that the clergy, the priests, and scholars were the ones who should be interpreting the scriptures for the masses.
That's a lot of power for the church.
It is. And they were worried about losing some of that control if people started reading and interpreting the Bible for themselves. They were also concerned about unorthodox beliefs spreading, ideas that didn't align with official church teachings.
That's really interesting. So in the middle of all this, you have John Wycliffe. He really wanted to make the Bible accessible to people in England.
Yeah, he was a real pioneer. He was one of the first to try to translate the Bible into English, and he was doing this back in the late 14th century.
Wow, so that was a pretty radical move back then.
It was, and he faced some serious pushback for it. Now, there's some debate about how much of the translation he actually did himself.
Okay.
He had a lot of followers, and they were definitely involved in the project. But whether he personally translated the whole thing or not, his influence was massive.
And he was working from the Latin Vulgate, right?
That's right. That was the text he had to work with.
Got it. And the church, they weren't happy about this, were they?
Not one bit. They condemned Wycliffe's efforts.
But he was already dead by then, wasn't he?
Yeah, he died in 1384. But the church condemned him posthumously.
Wow. They really wanted to make a point.
They did, and his followers, who were known as Lollards, faced some pretty intense persecution.
That's awful.
It was. But despite all the opposition, the desire for an English Bible just kept growing. People were hungry for the scriptures in their own language.
And that brings us to another big name, William Tyndale.
William Tyndale was crucial in this whole story. He comes along in the early 16th century, and he does something really significant.
What did he do?
He decided to translate the Bible directly from the original Hebrew and Greek.
Oh, wow. So he wasn't just working from the Latin like Wycliffe had done.
No, he went right back to the source languages.
That's a big deal.
It was a major shift, and his work laid the foundation for pretty much all the English translations that came after him.
He was kind of like a linguistic trailblazer.
Absolutely.
But his story doesn't have a happy ending, does it?
No, it doesn't. He was met with even more fierce opposition than Wycliffe.
Why was that?
Well, his translations were considered a serious threat to the church's authority. They saw it as heresy. He was eventually arrested and executed for his work.
That's tragic. He was killed just for translating the Bible.
It's a stark reminder of how dangerous ideas could be, especially when they challenged the established power structures of the time.
And he never even finished his Old Testament translation.
No, he didn't.
What a loss. But even though he was killed, his work was still incredibly important, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
His translations were so good, so accurate, they influenced all the English Bibles that came after him. His work truly left a lasting legacy.
So then we come to the Protestant Reformation, which really shook things up.
Right. The Protestant Reformation was a huge turning point, not just for Christianity, but for Western culture as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
It started in the 16th century, and one of its core ideas was sola scriptura.
What does that mean?
It's Latin, and it basically means scripture alone.
Okay.
So the idea was that the Bible, not the church or tradition, should be the ultimate authority in matters of faith.
So that really put the emphasis on individual interpretation of the Bible.
Exactly. The reformers believed that everyone should have access to the Bible and be able to read and interpret it for themselves.
So this created a whole new environment for the development of English Bibles.
Absolutely. One of the key figures in the Reformation, Martin Luther, actually translated the Bible into German.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he believed that the Bible should be available in the language that people actually spoke.
Makes sense.
And this idea really resonated with people all over Europe.
So this sets the stage for the King James Bible.
It does. By the time King James I came to the throne of England in 1603, there was a real need for a new English translation.
Why was that?
Well, there were a lot of different translations floating around, and they weren't all consistent with each other.
So it was causing some confusion.
Definitely. And it was causing some division within the Church of England.
So what did King James do?
Well, he was a pretty shrewd guy. He saw an opportunity to unify the country, at least religiously.
Yeah.
So in 1604, he commissioned a new translation of the Bible.
And that became the King James Version.
That's right.
And that's the one that we still hear about so much today.
Yes.
Why is that? What's so special about the King James Version?
Well, for one thing, it was a massive scholarly undertaking.
Oh, they put a lot of work into it.
Oh, yeah. King James assembled this team of top scholars, experts in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin.
They were the best of the best.
Absolutely. And they took their time, really pored over those ancient texts, trying to capture the meaning as accurately as possible.
So it's known for its accuracy.
Yes, but it's also famous for its beautiful language.
Oh, right. It has that very distinct style.
It does, and it was a major influence on English literature and language. Think of some of the most famous phrases in the English language. Turn the other cheek, the salt of the earth, a wolf in sheep's clothing.
I had no idea those came from the King James Bible.
They do. And writers from Shakespeare to Milton to the American founding fathers, they were all deeply influenced by the King James Bible.
Wow, it really permeated the culture.
It did. And even though it wasn't the first English translation, it became the most widely read and the most influential. It shaped religious thought for centuries.
Okay, so we've talked about how the English Bible came to be, but its influence goes way beyond religion, right?
Oh, definitely. It's touched so many aspects of English-speaking culture. It's influenced art, literature, music, politics, you name it.
In what ways?
Well, think about it. It shaped our moral values, it's inspired social movements, it's played a role in political debates.
Give me an example.
Well, look at the abolitionist movement, the fight to end slavery in the United States. People like Sojourner Truth. She was a powerful abolitionist speaker, and she often drew directly from the Bible in her arguments against slavery.
I can see how that would be really persuasive.
Right? She used biblical passages about equality and justice to challenge people's consciences.
That's amazing. And the printing press was a game changer, wasn't it? It made the Bible much more accessible to ordinary people.
Absolutely. When Gutenberg invented the printing press in the 15th century, that was a watershed moment for human history.
I bet.
And the Bible was one of the first books to be mass-produced.
So that meant that more people could afford to own one.
Exactly. And that led to increased literacy rates. It also meant that people could read and interpret the Bible for themselves without having to rely on priests or scholars to tell them what it meant.
That's a huge shift in how people approached faith in the Bible.
It was a move towards a more individualistic approach to religion.
And then you start seeing different religious denominations forming, right? Like the Puritans, the Baptists, the Methodists, and the Quakers.
Exactly. Those groups were all deeply shaped by the Bible, but they had different interpretations of its teachings. They formed their own communities based on their understanding of the scriptures.
And the Bible was particularly influential in the American colonies, wasn't it?
It was. It was seen as the moral bedrock of society. People looked to the Bible for guidance on everything, from family life to politics. It really permeated American culture from the very beginning.
So the story of the English Bible, it doesn't end with the King James Version, right? There are tons of different translations out there now.
Oh yeah, the King James Version is still around, and it's still loved by many. But there have been a lot of other translations over the centuries. The Revised Standard Version, the New International Version, the English Standard Version, just to name a few.
Why so many different translations?
Well, language changes over time, so there's always a need for updated translations that use more modern language.
That makes sense.
And there are also different approaches to translation.
Like what?
Well, some translations try to be as literal as possible, sticking really close to the original Hebrew and Greek.
Uh-huh.
Others prioritize readability, aiming for a translation that's easy for modern readers to understand, even if it means taking some liberties with the wording.
So there's no one perfect translation.
Not really. It depends on what you're looking for. Some translations are better for study, while others are better for devotional reading.
That makes sense. And the Bible has truly become a global book, hasn't it?
Or absolutely. It's been translated into over 3,000 languages. It's the most translated book in all of human history.
Mm-hmm.
And English translations continue to play a huge role in missionary work and academic study all over the world.
And then you have the digital revolution, which has made it even more accessible than ever before.
Right. We've got websites, apps, audio Bibles. You can access the Bible on your phone, your tablet, your computer. It's amazing.
It is amazing. So looking back over this incredible journey, it's pretty remarkable to think about how far the Bible has come. From ancient scrolls, handwritten by dedicated scribes, to a digital text that people can access instantly from anywhere in the world.
It's a testament to the power of this text, how it's endured through centuries of change. And it's a story of faith, of perseverance in the face of obstacles. It's a story about the evolution of language and the human quest to understand something bigger than ourselves.
And we can't forget all the individuals who played such vital roles in this story. The prophets, the apostles, those scribes who painstakingly copied the texts, and the reformers who risked their lives to make the Bible available in English.
It's humbling to think of their dedication and the impact their work has had on the world.
Understanding the history of the Bible, the cultural context that shaped its development, and the journey it took to become the English text we know today, it really deepens our appreciation for its significance.
It does. It shows us that the Bible isn't just a religious text. It's a window into history, into human culture, into the evolution of language.
And it's played a fundamental role in shaping Western civilization, particularly through the English translations, from Wycliffe to Tyndale to the King James Version. These translations shaped the religious identity of millions and influenced everything from literature and law to art and politics.
And that brings us to a thought-provoking question for our listeners to consider.
Okay, hit us with it.
We live in an increasingly interconnected world, a world where information travels at the speed of light. And with so many new translations emerging, and digital technology making the Bible more accessible than ever before, what does this mean for the future of the Bible?
That is a great question. What do you think?
Well, I think we're seeing a shift in how people engage with the Bible.
How so?
It's becoming less about dogma and more about personal interpretation. People are exploring the Bible in new ways, using digital tools to compare translations, to delve into the historical context, to connect with other readers around the world.
So, in a way, it's coming full circle, going back to a more individualized approach to faith.
I think so. It's a fascinating time to be studying the Bible, and I think the most exciting chapters in this story are yet to be written.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the history of the Bible. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure exploring this amazing story with you and our listeners.